welcome to Neocast, the podcast that brings you closer to your favorite authors. My guest today is P.G. Herring, the author of As Iron Sharpens Iron. And before we start the interview, I'm gonna let him introduce himself.
Hi everyone, my name is Patrick. I'm from New York, Long Island. I am 30 years old, and I've been writing for maybe about, I'd say, almost a decade, a little later than most people I would think, that enjoy writing very much. And I really just, it's one of my hobbies. I also like horticulture and doing many different things. So I kind of like spreading out and trying a lot of different things and learning things and always growing. And prior to being here on Long Island, I went overseas for a couple of years in the Peace Corps. In the US, it's kind of like a program aside from serving in the military. Like we live in other countries for multiple years. So I was in South America for about 4 years, and I served in Paraguay for 2 years, and then the Peruvian Amazon for 1. And in that Peruvian Amazon is where I actually wrote As Iron Sharpens Iron, ironically. And now I'm back home in Long Island and working, and I work for the VA.
You have so much experience, and that's something that I wanted to ask you about. Aside from your literary projects, how is life in a Peace Corps?
It's I would describe it as an experience that kind of will pop you out of whatever bubble of the world you're in, and it's the hard. I mean, this kind of like their slogan is, "It's the hardest, but it's the greatest experience you'll ever have." And it's a true statement, because you go somewhere, and a lot of times, not only are you away from everybody you know, but you also have to not only incorporate yourself and your schedule and your tendencies into a different culture, but also learn a completely different language, which is sometimes the hardest part. But it's, what I realized after a while was it was a gift, because I was able to focus on learning the language, and all the other stuff that might be hard if I didn't have to learn the language and I might be frustrated with. I was just like, oh, okay, this is easy. I just need to, tell them how, that I want to go this, like a basic sentence that I couldn't get out properly. So you're struggling in that way. So, but it definitely is a beautiful experience, because I could think back in my time in Paraguay, and like I have brothers and sisters there, and they're completely other side of the world, a family. And looking back on it, it's probably like the best experience of my life.
What made you decide to go into the Peace Corps?
I think it was a culmination of a lot of things. Growing up on Long Island, like a suburban neighborhood, you're in a bubble like everybody else is in a bubble. But once you kind of realize that your bubble really inhibits you from understanding many different peoples, and you kind of come to that realization, well, hopefully you come to that realization that this isn't reality for 99.9% of the world. So I did come to that realization, but also, especially growing up in the early 2000s with the Iraq War and Afghanistan, there was always that side of me that wanted to serve in some way. And when you're that young, the military is usually the only one that anybody knows about. That's like the only national service. But it doesn't fit everybody's, goals or personality and their mission in life or something like that. So that was always an option, but it just never happened for me for whatever reason. But I always had this kind of respect for the older people that I knew that had to go and do and serve in Afghanistan and Iraq. So that was always in the back of my mind. Well, I have to do something, because a lot of people are 1% of the population here in the United States is taking on like a huge burden. And they're generally 18 to 20-year-old men that are told to do something by 60-year-old men, right? So it's not their fault that they have to go over there, but they're trying to do the best they can and be good people and help other people, because they're told that this is a problem and you have to do this, and they raise their hand. So it's an amazing thing kind of volunteer for that. So that's kind of like my push towards service. And then when I found the Peace Corps, it just fit perfectly because I always wanted to learn another language. I always wanted to have that struggle to get out of that bubble of the United States suburbs. And it was like the perfect fit for me personally.
Was it a hard decision to go back to Long Island?
No, I kind of felt like I experience everything I want to experience. And there's a certain, you get out and you're kind of like, oh, finally I escaped. And then I experienced everything and I still had a connection to home. My girlfriend was home, but she also joined the Peace Corps later on. So then we both finished our services and we had family here. And at that point, I think we were both comfortable, kind of like, all right, it is home and we do have like people that love us here and we want to settle down and have that experience too. And you kind of come back to it with that kind of plethora of wisdom and understanding where you can now place yourself here, but you're not going to get trapped in a bubble again in your mind, kind of.
And do you maybe contemplate doing something similar in the future?
Yeah, like I knew a lot of people that were much older than me that were Peace Corps volunteers. Sometimes you'll see, one or two in the 50s or 60s after they have a full career. So that's pretty amazing. So, I mean, that could be a goal at the end of my life. Do it one more time.
Do you still volunteer here in Long Island?
Not as much. I've been here for maybe it's about 2 years. So I settled into working finally. And then once you live here, there's a million different costs. And you have to, taxes and things. So you have to like settle down and get a full career and make money. And there's that battle. So it is very difficult, especially you don't have that like privilege of being a student and working part-time. You kind of have like this flexibility, like, well, maybe I'll do this. But once you get grounded, it's probably it's more important to do something locally now, and that's kind of like what I want to do is more local volunteer work. But the thing here is, and I think it's kind of the critique that I placed in the book a little bit is sense of community and localization of like a populace it's very difficult because everyone works 30 minutes from where they live or an hour or two. And so they're there like 70% of the day. And then they come home and they're in their little, bubbles of their home and stuff. And it's very like, and not all places are laid out with like in Latin America has like a plaza and then everyone's working in the same neighborhood. So it's a different feeling. And you feel like really far away from like your neighbors or you don't even speak to your neighbors half the time. So it's something I don't enjoy. But just got to push yourself and change that kind of culture, I guess. And that's what future generations, I guess, should focus on.
And I think that this sense of community is something that you can also find in your article, Character Accounts, I think, that was published on Medium for the people listening to us. You also write articles on Medium.
Yeah, it was a cool platform. It was like the first platform I ever used. That I put stuff that I used to write on paper or just I had in my mind publicly, like just like posting it out there for the most part. And that one I wrote, ironically, so I wrote that one with one of my childhood friends, Frankie, about somebody who was like a mentor to us that was trying to do something locally. So we wrote this little piece together about him. And ironically, the story of As Iron Sharpens Iron, the genesis of it started with, I was texting him when I was in Peru and he was just like, oh, we should do something together again. And I was like, well, why don't we just write like a short story together or something? And he was like, all right, like, what do you want to write about? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I kind of want to write about like something like real. I don't remember what I was reading. I was reading like a young adult novel for some reason. I was reading something pretty random, what I usually read. I want to say it was like 13 Reasons Why. And I finished it. And I was like, oh, I was entertained. I was like, oh, it's, but I was like, there's something about it. I was like, I didn't like love it. So I was like, I want to write like a young adult thing, like a short story that's like real, but can hopefully like captivate somebody to keep reading it. in a way that's like, I don't know, like a film with John Steinbeck, like some of his novels, it's not necessarily that there's crazy things happening. It's that the dialogue and the inner thoughts of the protagonists and the characters is like kind of pulling, like you're like, ooh, like that was a good thought, or that was a good thing, and that was a good conversation. So I wanted to do that. So then I was like, okay, I'm going to start writing this and see what you think. And I just, when I start writing, it kind of just flowed. And he was like helping, like he was like a co-pilot. It was like, that was good. That was good. He's like, maybe you should see it that way. And then it turned into like hundreds of pages of me just like free flowing from an idea of a short story.
And I think it's interesting that you were actually reading a YA novel at the time, because I think that the thing about As Iron Sharpens Iron that I like the most, that it's not targeted towards a certain audience. I think that it's a story that can you can relate to when you're a teenager, or you can relate to whenever, because all the feelings and all the things that are mentioned are universal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um,
I felt like I felt like it was like kind of like young adult because the characters. So um, Paul and Aaron are obviously the main characters, so they're young. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't like something that they wouldn't think or they wouldn't say, but they had some like forethought into the future, like they're geniuses. So I wanted to be awkward, and I wanted them to be, you know, dislikable in some senses. Like, and I wanted everything to be real. Um, so that's kind of where I was focusing on. And then when I incorporated the idea of having Paul's brother, who in the story is killed in Iraq, but the way you communicate his legacy on his brother, and his legacy is from journal entries that he had. And even so really I was playing around, and it was difficult to see if it would work, but I just went with it, where I was jumping from Paul's perspective to Aaron's perspective to a journal entry, and then to a third person narrative, which I always thought of as kind of a godly figure, but not in the sense that it's like one God looking down. It was like this eternal, and that's kind of why I named it an eternal. It was like this eternal being. So it's kind of like Michael in a sense, watching, but it's kind of like that culmination of humanity watching over and showing its dialogue in short, brief, you know, little glimpses.
and by the way, I wanted to ask you, why did you choose to talk about Michael Murphy, Paul's brother?
That was something I was surprised that you picked up on, because it was kind of just a little nod to like a local hero, and I didn't think anyone was going to think, but I just like the clever, like I was like, I'll put his last name as Murphy, and then I'll make his brother's name Michael, and Michael Murphy, and and like that was kind of just a thing that I didn't think was like going to be picked up on, but it in a sense that I was trying to portray his older brother as this young man who um, and when I incorporated Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius quotes into it, that was kind of pulling into these young men who are 18, who raise their hand to do something that sacrifices their own, you know, wellness and happiness in many ways for a population that kind of, like I said, can't even get along with each other next, you know, being neighbors. So it's something that is pretty profound. And I thought of it as, okay, Michael's this stoic figure that is sacrificing his young adulthood for his brother's young adulthood. So in a sense, I kind of saw myself in a way relating to Paul and Aaron, because they were having the privilege of growing up and being awkward and meeting up with girls and going out drinking and doing everything that a high school kid needs to experience in a way and make mistakes, because his brother decided to forfeit all that and go somewhere else to make sure that their lives are protected.
And well, I actually didn't really pick up on Michael Murphy. I actually Googled him
Oh,
because,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, well, for the people who don't know who Michael Murphy is, could you say who he is?
Sure. So Michael Murphy was a Navy SEAL from Long Island, and he was killed in Afghanistan. And there's a book called Soul Survivor, Um, and it describes, a group of Navy SEALs who went into Afghanistan, and they were trying to get one of the leaders of a Taliban group, but they were compromised by a goat herder, local, saw them, and they weren't sure what to do, and they had to obviously just release him because he wasn't, a threat to them or part of the Taliban. But the Taliban were notified they were up in the mountains and they were attacked. So all of them were killed except for the one sole survivor in Marcus Luttrell. So he tells the story of Michael Murphy. But he's from Long Island, and he's buried out here, and he's kind of this local hero for many people in Long Island.
At first, I thought that you knew someone from Michael's family. That was my initial thought.
Oh yeah, no. Well, I work for the VA, so I mean, I have a good knowledge of a lot of these young men who were killed in action overseas, and it's something that I think a lot of people should know, even if you had your disagreements or you didn't support the obvious mistakes made. They were very young men who just signed up to try to help other people and protect a way of life, of freedom, of being able to live without violence. So you have to kind of respect that and really remember it. I think it's very important.
And I think it's something that is so rare to see in YA fiction, trauma led by war, especially because it's not a topic that is much talked about in things that are not about war in general. And I also want to point out that you wrote an article about realism in war literature that is also on Medium. And I thought that it was interesting what you the point that you made about how World War I and World War II were the catalyst of how we stopped romanticizing war in literature. And yeah, did something inspire that article? Was it something that you realized by yourself, or did you read something about it?
A lot of those articles and a lot of the journal entries, like the novel isn't autobiographical in any sense. I'm pulling like an amalgamation of different people and experiences from my youth and things like that, and trying to throw them, make characters out of them and situations and things like that. But the only thing that I would say is closely related to me writing just personally would be the journal entries and things like that, because those are things I just do kind of for fun. Well, I have initial thought and I'll be like, oh, that's an interesting thought. And then I'll write something down. And if I get that flow of, okay, this idea isn't that bad, it's kind of something to dig into, then I'll start writing it. And that's kind of one of them. Whereas it was like, I think a lot of what we hear now, and I think it's kind of like a good and bad thing about the current conflicts in the world. There's a narrative of, it's not romanticized at all, which is a good thing. You shouldn't romanticize war, but you also shouldn't blame the 18-year-old that really is trying to do good. He's not making the decision. He's not starting the conflict in most situations. So as long as it's that, and he's trying to just protect and protect a way of life of many freedoms to be who you want to be and say what you want to say and live a peaceful life. You can't throw them into that kind of filth of the reasons why it started. And I think the romanticism of past wars was it was a rite of passage. And I don't think it's a rite of passage. There's many rites of passage. You don't have to, be violent. And I think that was a problem with that kind of 20th century. But I mean, it stopped maybe. It probably didn't stop completely, but we at least have this understanding for the most part that there's nothing romantic about it. Kind of like there's nothing really romantic about going to a bar and getting wasted, but there is that romanticism of a bar, right? That's what
Yeah.
the movies kind of portray. So I think it's good to kind of call BS on it in a sense, but also not throw some people that are just trying to do good in that mix. And that's kind of where I think I got that idea of writing that from.
And I think that it's also linked to how we can criticize things that are considered as rituals and rites of passage, whether it's in American culture or in any other cultures, where you have to do something at a certain age. There are like thresholds of experience. And I think that war is a great example of how we've been pushing towards this sort of I'd say standardized lives, ideals. And I wanted to know, because the article was specifically about war literature, was it informed by any piece of literature you thought about?
Yeah, I like reading. For some reason, what really pulls me is kind of, I guess, what we would call classics. But like I really enjoy John Steinbeck novels for his kind of realist conversational style and his way to pull you and keep you turning the page just based on these inner thoughts of their characters. And I kind of like Fitzgerald a lot because I just like the way he writes and his symbolism and his turn of a phrase and things like that. But for the most part, I like reading older things because I like that they're tragic. They're kind of like they're stuck in their own world, and it's nice to kind of read something and pull it. Like I feel like it's more of a learning experience for me and enjoyable to see where Fitzgerald went wrong, where his romanticism and his thought process like really destroyed him in a sense, because he's such a fantastic writer, but he obviously had problems like everybody else. And I could look at Steinbeck and see how progressive he was on some labor issues and things like that. Or I could see how he was a little wrong on something else. Whereas if I read something more contemporary and modern, I feel like I'm experiencing that every day. Like I already know the opinions of everybody. I already know the current events. I don't like need it anymore. Like I want to learn something from somebody in the past. Like I want to see their mistakes because they're obviously most of the part not here anymore, and they can't be they can be politicized, but to me they're there. I mean, I can give them okay, they tried to be the best person they could in 1920. I understand why they were this and that and this in a sense. Like you get a pass. Whereas in somebody in 2021, I can't really give a pass to you because you should be picking up on this stuff. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean, because I actually wrote a memoir on, it's called a memoir in French, but it's more like it's a dissertation on cancel culture and how we tend to make people accountable for things they've done in the past. And it's a very, very current trend.
Yeah.
But yeah, with well, more ancient piece of fiction and more ancient artists and writers, they get the benefit of the doubt because that was another era.
Yeah, I feel like it it's done. It's almost like it's something that's done with good intentions, but it's going to be it's more destructive because there's such a good learning experience in reading something like that. Like there's a reason why libraries don't really or shouldn't ban books. Like we don't ban books usually because even though you're going to get some people that maybe say radicalize on some idea, but you're going to get more if it's in the black market in a sense. You need it open and you need people to argue why it's crazy, why this is horrible thing to think why this person went wrong. You need that conversation and that understanding. And I think, and you also need that kind of sense of, say the person did write that or do something, but then they're at this place and they already are, repentant or, trying to be a better person. You got to give them that chance too to move on and participate and show somebody else that's younger than them, hey, don't do this because look what happened to me. You can't kind of ostracize. So I think there's a huge learning experience for society to move forward in the direction it's going. And I feel like that's the intention of a lot of these things. But in a sense, it's going to be more aggressive because of it.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, are they still banned books in American libraries?
My first job ever when I started reading, because I started reading late, like 18 maybe, I got a job as a page in a library, just putting books away, and that's where I started reading. But I mean, they had Mein Kampf. I know that. No one took it out, I don't think. But I know that some books, because here, like local school boards will pick the book students read. And sometimes they'll ban books. Like I think they banned, like some local schools would ban, I would say like The Grapes of Wrath or something, or something for a line in it or an idea. If it's like, quote unquote, like at a certain point, maybe in the 50s, it was banned because it was deemed communist, about labor unions and things like that. So it's not a federal thing, but it's more like a local. So if it's a very conservative society, they could ban a book so their high school students don't read it.
And is where you live similar to where Paul and Aaron live?
Sort of, yeah. So I grew up on the South Shore of the island. And then since I had this idea, because I just thought it would be fun, to place the story in the Great Gatsby's world, just so I could research, I'll make up, I'll do West Egg, East Egg, because technically it does exist on Long Island. It's just named something different, but there is that part of the island that goes up on the North Shore. And that's what he's writing about, the North Shore and the more wealthier parts of the island. So I was like, oh, that's cool. And then my friend Frank was like, he really liked that idea. So then we just went with it. And I started researching the train stops in the novel. So they hit the train stops the same as the Great Gatsby. And it kind of paints that. And then they hang out at the mansion, which is Gatsby's mansion, that's all decaying and crumbled. And that's where all the kids hang out and drink. So it's kind of like, it's a good, I guess, metaphor in a way of where society moves and what replaces it. Like I always liked the line where it was saying, like, I think one of them was saying inside that the cops never come to the mansion and let us do whatever we want there. And I assume it's kind of like when all the rich people are there partying, they just ignore it in the same way, but for different reasons. Like, so I was kind of playing with that a little bit.
And Gatsby is one of the many references to literature you've done in the book. I wanted to know, how do those references resonate with the story that you wanted to tell?
In terms of like Fitzgerald's writing, actually, The Great Gatsby is just, I always wish I could write the way he writes that book. That's like the coolest, I feel like, style I ever read. Like, it's not the best maybe storyline I ever read, but it's the style he does it, the symbolism of the green light and things like that. I think that's what makes him so popular. But really, the novel to me reflects. I don't know if you've ever read This Side of Paradise by Fitzgerald.
No, not yet.
I
have it in my bookshelf, but I've never read it.
It's interesting. It was the novel that made him popular as a young man, and he wrote it to for all the wrong reasons, to impress his wife at the time, who was his girlfriend trying to marry. So he's trying to make money and impress a girl over writing a book, basically. But he wanted to be a writer, obviously. But he wrote this novel, and it was kind of similar in the vein of every book he writes is essentially kind of autobiographical, because he's playing with the story of his life and his struggles, and he's honest about it for the most part. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He knows he's like a hopeless romantic, and he knows he's steering in the wrong direction. So you can see that in his writing. But in This Side of Paradise, it's a very like staggered book about a young man who goes to college and then he has to go to war and then he comes home and he's like, he's kind of like, what was it all about in a sense? So in a way, the style of it being kind of like, well, where am I in the story right now? Is similar to as Iron Sharpens Irons to me, and the feel of it was similar. So I always kind of relate that book to when I was writing this one.
You relate to any of the characters?
Not as much. I feel like when I was focusing on the characters and the dialogue, I was really thinking of kind of my enjoyment of Steinbeck novels. And like I was always trying to focus like I got to use the Long Island accent because I have to be real in it. Like Steinbeck and Grapes of Wrath, sometimes you don't even really understand what the person's saying in the dialogue because he's using their kind of colloquial isms in there. And I wanted to do that, and I wanted the inner thoughts to be immature, but kind of like almost profound. Like they're almost there on some thoughts, and that's kind of like it was. That was very like my Steinbeck kind of obsession. And then Fitzgerald was more in that the journal entries. Like I was trying to, as I just like to do personally, use a phrase and try to spin it and spin it and spin it into an idea. And then I think, I mean, that's really the two that I feel like, and then it was that whole kind of young adult thing where I wanted to write about depression, but in the more realistic sense of the majority of people that struggle with depression, where it's very subtle and it's unpredictable. You don't know if that one line that somebody writes in their notebook is legitimate or not. Because in the story, I had the whole issue starting with Aaron writing a Nirvana lyric in his notebook. So obviously you have that like, well, he's just writing a lyric. Well, Kurt Cobain killed himself. Well, is he relating to that? Why is he relating to that? And playing with that, because that's the more subtle depression I think that most people experience, obviously. And then there's that severe one that we kind of get most books in, because that's what's kind of the pull. Like 13 Reasons Why is like a really vicious kind of book in a sense. Like it's kind of like, well, I hope that doesn't happen in real life. Like it's pretty horrible in all sorts of fronts, right? For the people, for the main character that kills herself, but also to all the people involved who are going to be traumatized by that experience, right?
And I guess that portraying depression is something that is very hard to do because it's so different from one person to another, and there's very severe to very mild forms of depression. It's just little things, the things that that person is gonna do on a daily basis that matters, and that is the less obvious form of depression. And I think that's what is interesting with the characters and with how they relate to each other, this friendship, how they are how he's trying to be there for Aaron,
but he's like the brash friend that takes way too many risks, kind of.
Yeah.
And I think the main another core element of it, and I really wanted it to be a main focus of the book, is kind of like the wall of sound behind them, because to me, growing up and being a young adult, every day is covered in the background of whatever you're listening to, because you're always listening to something. To me, like no matter who you are, in a sense, you always kind of have that background music of your favorite bands you're going to put on when you have the time, or you're going to put on when you're hanging out with friends. So I wanted that. And actually that reminds me too, I said Soul Survivor for the Marcus Luttrell book. It's Lone Survivor. Soul Survivor is an Angels and Airwaves song. I kind of mixed up there. But so Angels and Airwaves for them. And I wanted to I wanted to do this with music. And I throw a lot of elements of religion in there, because religion and philosophy in there is the inescapable kind of Western society that they're born into. And even if in a good ways you reject most of it, it's going to be with you because it's built into the society over hundreds of thousands of years. So they have that forced upon them, especially Paul, and he has the knowledge in his head and he doesn't really like to use it, but he does like to use it, and he likes it, you know, maybe in the comfort of himself, he doesn't like it publicly, so he's battling with that. But for Paul and Aaron, that music, and I have the band Angels and Airwaves as their kind of one thing that's like, oh, hey, you like that band too? Oh, I like that band too. And then it becomes like their own religion, but a healthy religion of saying like, oh, I really love those lyrics and I love the music to it and it makes me feel good and all this stuff. So the music is such a core part of the novel because it's kind of that glue that helps them relate to the world they're in. And it's the one that actually makes them communicate in a healthy way to each other, because talking about depression or talking about religion is kind of taboo and difficult to talk about. But the media of the music, where if you have, you know, the Angels and Airwaves song, I referenced Valkyrie Missile, where it's kind of that uplifting song to get you out of a depression. That's the conduit they're using to talk to each other. And then they have, I reference kind of the two songs I like the most referenced together is that Valkyrie Missile song by Angels and Airwaves and the brand new Millstone song, because they're kind of juxtaposed, because one is just somebody dealing with severe depression where they hate themselves, and they're kind of like, they're saying, you know, I'm my own stone around my neck. I'm the reason I'm a horrible person right now. And the other one saying, you know, it's like a friend saying, all right, like, you know, you can get up off the ground and you could, you know, I'm here to help you. So I like the way that Aaron was relating to Millstone and Paul was using Falcon Missile to try to kind of like, you know, say, I'm going to create this day for my friend that hopefully shows him some kind of glimmer of hope that, you know, that he will have bad days, but, and he'll make mistakes, but there's always that next day to recover and the next day to do something good. So they're both just, in essence, just trying to be good people, but in a real way.
I feel like Paul's way of being there for Aaron is the way that most people would act if their friend was going through depression, trying to do their best to give that glimmer of hope, despite not really knowing if that's gonna work. Doing really striving to do their best. And I thought that was really sweet because, again, in books about depression, they're usually focused on the person that is dealing with depression and not necessarily on the characters that acknowledge that depression and that are trying to also do their best, or it's misrepresented. But it was interesting to have his input on this issue. So yeah, and regarding the music and or specifically about the religion, I feel like it's also how I think As Iron Sharpens Iron is really a book about the American teenage experience, because when you think about it, it's most of what they're talking about and most of what they experience is very American, in the sense that this proximity to religion is very ingrained in American society. So that's why I initially thought that it was sort of autobiographical.
I would say the music is I'd say the music and the journal entries are the closest to autobiographical, because I felt like, especially when I started writing and my friend Frankie was kind of guiding me along with it, that was like our own glue together too as young people. So we knew where we were going with that, in a sense. Like I was like, I want to put this way, and he's like, oh yeah, of course. Like so he would always like be like, yeah, that's got to be it. So it was helpful in that sense. But definitely it's very American, because and also being somewhere else and not being obviously here, I was able to look at it in a more objective way. I was able to kind of critique it and then say things that I think that were kind of like that little bit of why maybe some people would like to live there, or some people like living there, in a sense. Whereas if I was here, you're kind of in it and I might be like bitter. I'm like, there's nothing good about it. But but in a sense, I was pulled away from it, and I felt like I had a more open mind. And it's kind of like a lot of writing for me is I'll be dormant and I'll just read or something, and I'll have a lot of dormancy, and then all of a sudden I'll like sprinkle a little bit, and then all of a sudden I could write something larger like that. Whereas I don't think I could like consistently just every day write something. And I felt like I had a long dormancy and then a clear outlook on that reflection of growing up in American suburbs. And I think that was very helpful because even learning another language, and you probably know this, when you have two different languages in your head, it opens your mind because it's not only that you know more words, but there are phrases and thought patterns that don't connect. So then it's like you have this openness too, where before you like, oh, like I understand that, but I can't translate that to you. So it's interesting to me because I felt like I had this better understanding of where I grew up from.
Yeah. But also when you're learning a new language, there's also a new understanding of another culture. Because as you said, there are phrases that you can't translate because they have meaning for that particular culture that you don't in your personal culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when the characters of As Iron Sharpens Iron sort of criticize their culture, the culture that they always known, have been raised in, is it something that you did in your life, maybe having seeing a big picture of how you were raised and questioning it at some point?
Yeah, definitely. I think there was definitely lines in the novel where I was describing them walking home, and there would be these neatly spaced houses, nicely groomed, perfect lawns, perfect streets, perfectly paved.
Yeah.
And I was reflecting that, and growing up in that, obviously nothing's perfect, but that looks pretty perfect. And most people are gonna see that. And I remember I taught my computer classes to kids a lot in Paraguay, and they would watch movies and they'd see New York City, or they'd see a suburb of America, and they'd be like, "Oh, it looks amazing." I was like, "It looks amazing, but there's a lot in that. There's inside those homes," and I try to communicate that inside those homes, it's not always so. It's not perfect. There's ugliness in there. There's a lot of things that are unhealthy for people in those neatly groomed societies. And I was reflecting that from where I was, where the streets weren't paved. The homes weren't perfectly sided and painted, and there wasn't a perfect lawn on the front. But it was, in a lot of ways, some of those homes were a lot warmer than many homes here. So I'd much rather be there, in a sense. So I think once people realize that, you don't need, a big home to be happy. It's pretty obvious, but also the neatly perfect looking communities aren't necessarily the best ones to live in. I could tell you a million other places probably that are better than some. So I was trying to communicate that, and that was like my critique of that, but also not just like a bitter critique. It felt more genuine because I was sitting in a place where I was like, I'm very happy here, and I have none of that. So what's the deal?
And at first, as I said in one of my emails, I thought that this critique of American suburban life was, or American society was linked to the character Holden from The Catcher in the Rye, and especially about how he criticizes adults because of the use of the word phony that that Salinger uses a lot in that novel. And I thought it was linked to this particular book, and was it?
Yeah, I definitely I enjoyed that book, reading it, and I liked putting that. I liked Paul having that connection with it, because I think he experienced the phoniness more so than Aaron, and I felt like he would attach himself to it, whereas he grew up in a home that was abusive, where he used to watch his brother get beat up by his father. And I think as a young person, when you experience something like that, you do get that kind of like, well, they're adults, they're supposed to be smarter, they're supposed to be, wiser in many ways, but many of them aren't. So how phony is this? Who am I speaking to most of the time? My teacher in front of me plays this role, but he's probably a phony, like that kind of attitude. And it's like, you tell me not to drink, but I just saw you wasted the other night, you're a phony. You told me not to smoke cigarettes, but you're smoking cigarettes. Like, what's the deal? So it's that calling out of that kind of mentality, especially with adults. If you're an adult and you're telling a young person not to do something, but you're obviously doing it. So what is it? I'm just not at the right age yet where I can do whatever vice it is. It's not a good conversation in a way. And I try to have them have that conversation of calling it out. Whereas, well, why don't they just tell us the honest truth? Why don't they just give us a real story? Why don't they just, instead of yelling at me for catching me smoking a cigarette, why don't you tell me your experience and why you don't think I should smoke? Right? It's kind of like there is something good there to be said. Like, you can relate a story of your own failure to help somebody out. But there's the phoniness of being like, that's bad, don't do it. And then I'm going to go in the back room and I'm going to do it.
And there's also the fact that they're told what they cannot do, but at the same time, they've probably done it. Those adults probably have done it in the past when they were younger.
Pretend like they didn't.
Yeah, and they pretend like they didn't. So that's what's interesting about it, is that it's obvious that all those mistakes are experiences sometimes that you have to experience in order to learn a lesson. And that's the hypocritical thing about adults, is that they're forbidding things, but they're not explaining it. It's like you have to live by a set of rules. It's like sort of like how some people understand a religion. There's a set of rules that you have to live by, but not really understanding why certain things are bad or certain things are good, how you have to behave.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and I tried to have Paul, and he has that knowledge from his childhood of the Christian beliefs. And I try to have him make fun of it. And then all of a sudden he'll say it and he'll be like, okay, that one's pretty good. Like, that one applies. It's not bad. So it's not like throwing out the whole thing. You could read Proverbs and call one and be like, that is ridiculous and the dumbest thing I ever read. And then you can go to the next line and be like, oh, okay, that one's pretty good. So I think there's that healthy kind of critical reading that needs to be had. And I tried to communicate with that.
Yeah, and do you think that when Aaron and Paul become adults, they're going to become this version of themselves that they don't want to become?
I tried at the end not to have anything crazy happen, because I did only stick to that reality of us, in a sense. But I hinted in a way that I was hoping that they wouldn't, because when Paul goes and in the morning before he even sees Aaron, he goes up to a rooftop and just puts 2 sodas on the top of a rooftop, in a sense, and just comes down, and it's kind of ridiculous. And in the whole story, you kind of see Paul struggling with, well, he's partying too much. He's trying to, fit into the party crowd, and he has no control over his urges, in a sense, even verbal or just with drinking or drugs, in a sense. So at the end, to have him kind of say to Aaron, hey, I don't need to drink with you to, our relationship is more than that phoniness. And I know I'm messing up there, but here, like, I understand it. Like, this, our friendship isn't based on a high school party, banter and gossip. I could just sit on a rooftop with you and just look up at the stars and enjoy myself. So I thought that was a maturity and a hope that they both understand the unhealthy side and critiquing where they can go wrong. Because Aaron, obviously, comes to that realization already, and that's what's causing him for the depression. He doesn't want to do that anymore, but he feels like he's obligated to. And Paul is kind of like, well, we're young, let's just do it. We'll stop. So then by the end, if Paul is kind of showing that kind of pause, it's that hope of maturity kind of pushing him. So hopefully not, I would think.
Yeah, I feel like very early on, you can see that Aaron has noticed that sort of social pressure to be like every other teenager, and it's something that he can't do. Not that he doesn't want to necessarily, but that he can't. And that's why it's interesting, is that they're very different but very similar in a way that they have a deeper understanding of each other, but Paul is more extroverted, sort of, that he fits better in this teenage environment, whereas Aaron is, I wouldn't say lost, but he sort of knows that he's not like all those teenagers, that he's different, but in a sense, he can rely on Paul to meet him halfway.
It's like a balancing kind of, and also I think with Paul in the novel, it's communicated, and Paul kind of says it, that Aaron isn't the greatest at the one-liners at a party, or kind of just gossiping at a party. He doesn't do it. He feels awkward, and it's noticeable. But that isn't a lose. I always see him outside speaking to one person, and it seems like they're actually enjoying one-on-one conversation. He doesn't enjoy the group, but who cares? It's not even that great of a conversation. Every time like an hour later, I see him speaking with somebody one-on-one, and they're actually having a real conversation. So he's wrong when he thinks that there's something wrong with him. There isn't. He's actually doing something more genuine and healthier by being able to communicate one-on-one with people. Who cares if you can't talk to 6 people at once?
Yeah. And what's also great about the book is that it's a slice of life that is happening in one day, and there is not necessarily any climax or any event that is major, and no conflict resolution by the end. They're just going through the book, and that's it. And it's very interesting for a piece of fiction, and especially for a fiction about teenagers, but because usually in YA you have that one problem that needs to be solved by the end of the book. It's the case here.
That was something active too. I was thinking about, I didn't want anything solved. I didn't want Aaron's depression solved. That's kind of ridiculous in a sense. I wanted one day of hope to pop in. Like, my friend took these ridiculous risks and showed me that anything's possible, right? And using that as like a metaphor for the night sky, like the stars, like there's endless possibility. You just have to focus on, getting better and trying to be a good person, but you'll never be perfect. So you kind of get over that fact. But also, and when I was writing it too, I felt like at times I should write that kind of proper turn, that proper, big event, because that's what books should do. But then I always came back to, what I think writing is about is you should write because you're having fun with it, and you're enjoying it, and you're thinking about it in your head, and you're putting it on paper, not necessarily because you want to sell it or you want to become renowned for it or popular for it. I think you have to enjoy writing it. And I wouldn't have enjoyed it if I had to make up this crazy scenario and all these, proper, breaks and following the rhythm of a novel, a typical novel, I guess, that would make sure that everyone's going to turn the page. No one's going to get bored. Well, sure, some people are going to get bored, but I'm writing it for myself. And if I'm not bored, who cares in a sense? I'm just trying to filter through the whole definition of the novel. And the one way I felt like breaking it up with the journal entries and having Michael's storyline in there, but it's very subtle, to me was that kind of like, okay, it has that like grit to it. It has that layer of like tragedy in a sense.
Oh, and was that your first time writing a piece of fiction?
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, I think I probably jotted down a few things, but nothing. It's usually not my style. I like kind of like poetic, like the journal entries. Like I'll get a thought and go with it, or something historical, political, and like an assessment. I enjoyed that. That was the first time I ever did that, and I feel like it's extremely hard. And people that do it a lot and do many books, it's impressive because I think you get to a point where you kind of like give up or something, and that's critical about having somebody read it with you, go over with you. Like if my friend Frankie wasn't into it, if he wasn't like, wow, that was a great little part you did there, or he was like, I don't know, you should probably change that up a little bit, it wouldn't be fun. Just sitting there doing it by yourself, in a sense, isn't that enjoyable. I think you need kind of that cohesion of somebody enjoying it and kind of rooting you on and co-piloting you on things. And also that you're writing it for yourself and not for some other goal or thing. You want to make more money, or I understand like being a professional writer, and I don't know how people do it because it's a lot of pressure and it's amazing when they do that. But I think you got to strike that balance when you do that. You got to write something that you enjoy, and if people enjoy it, that's great. There's like this. I always like this line. John Lennon. Somebody came to his house that was a huge fan, like kind of like too much of a fan, and he was obviously struggling with some kind of mental thing, drugs and something. And he was like, oh, when you wrote those lines, like you weren't writing about like something like me or something specific. And John was like, how can I be writing about you? I'm just writing about my life. I write, I love you, Yoko. I had a good day today, and that's it. And if it's relevant for you, that's great. But I'm just writing for me. And I always like that mentality, like that John Lennon kind of like, you like it or you don't like it. It's not why I do it.
I actually read a French book where the narrator says that it's a book, it's a fiction book about the publishing industry, and one of the characters, who's a literary critic, says that everyone always tend to find something to identify themselves with in a book, no matter what that book is, and sort of feel like that book was written for you because you have you find those elements that you can relate to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like, and that's the learning experience part of it, is relating to it. If you're reading it just to read it or just to get it, and it's a balance of entertainment and art. Like you can have a song or music, and there's an element of entertainment to it, and there should be like an element of art. Well, sometimes if it's just entertainment, it's just entertainment, and that's what it is. Like it's to dance or just enjoy in a sense. But if it's art, it's kind of like there's a spirit to it, and there's the poetry, and the music is making you feel a certain way. Like in the novel, the Jimmy World song I reference is 23, where Aaron felt like the music to him was taking him somewhere else, and he felt the music as this kind of spiritual meditation. And I think that's when music is best, is when it mixes that kind of spiritualness, and it's kind of like religious, like a mantra of the poem, or like the prose in the poem, right? And then you have that musical kind of landscape that's making your skin get chilled and kind of like that feeling. Like it is religious in a sense if it's done well.
And I love those characters, well, proximity to music, because in the life, it's true, you listen to music when you feel certain things, whether it's happiness or sadness or whatever. Music is always there, or you can like picture something and have music in your head, or even when you watch films and series, you have music, because music has to be the background of your experience or a certain experience. And that's what I love about the book. It's that spiritual way of seeing music.
Mm-hmm. And Aaron, there's this one part where Aaron, in the beginning, has these two posters of the Beatles and REM in his room. And he has them there because he remembers as a child, the first time he remembers himself feeling guilty of something, like he did something wrong and something went badly. And two songs that he used to hear over the radio just popped in his head. And then to this day, he doesn't understand why those two songs, to like, say a 6-year-old, would pop in their head as a relation to doing something bad. And I felt like that was a good starter for why music is so important to the novel, because they're not going to go into the Bible. They're not going to necessarily relate to the Bible when they make a mistake. They're not going to go deep into a Stoicism book. They're not there yet. They have this other religion, and that's in a healthier religion, in the sense that it's the music, and it's somebody that's just kind of saying like, all right, I've done something like that, like, and here's a song about it. And I think it's kind of simple, and they kind of relate that, and especially when they relate themselves like with the angels and airwaves, they're kind of seeing like that. It's kind of like a thank you to, in a sense, saying like Tom DeLonge, the writer, is genuinely giving his lyrics to them as like an older brother would give wisdom, and that's the way they take it. But it, like, in a healthy way. They're not like essentially fans, like they're going screaming at concerts, but they're kind of appreciative of whatever media he's giving them, the poem, in a sense, the feel of the music.
And it's totally unrelated, but did you want to be a writer when you were a child?
No, I think I said before, I didn't start reading a lot until I was about 18, and I started working at the library. And then writing started coming to me in short, like, little things when I was in my early 20s. And I just did it because I enjoyed it for the most part. I'd write like a little poem or something, or write a little journal entry or something like that. And then I realized, it's something that I enjoy doing. And this was the first time I've ever, and I had the free time, in a sense, like I had that alone time, and I had that reflection time to write something this big.
What was your writing process?
Well, when I was in Peru, when I would finish like my daily work, I was working with an NGO. So I had, at that point, like a 9-to-5 type work schedule. So when I would come home, I was on my own, and barely any internet. But what I would do is I would open my laptop, and I would have Google Docs open. And it was like amazing because it never failed. Like, even when I didn't have internet, if you write on offline, it saves it and then throws it online once it gets connected. So I did that throughout the whole novel. And essentially that was the only thing I did. And then I had a notebook where I would scribble little ideas in, and then I'd translate it to that. But it was kind of like a godsend that the Google Docs had that offline, online kind of capacity, because I would have to write everything, and that kind of is a different kind of feel, and more difficult, especially if writing that much. So that was my process, was that, and it was like every day I would sit down for at least an hour or so and write. But also every day I would have, especially like just sitting and eating, I would be going over things and thinking about things. So it was kind of all encompassing for that time period.
And when did you decide to integrate that third person narrator?
Early on, because initially I think my initial idea was just third person narrative. And then I was like, well, that's not going to get a genuine experience from the two main characters. So Paul and Aaron need to have their own perspectives. So I was like, maybe I'll throw them in it. And then it kind of built on that. So the first kind of opening was kind of written out. And then I was like, oh, I like it, but I don't like it. I need something crazy kind of to go happen. And that was the jumping idea throughout. And then I had to, and I don't know if I achieved it well, but having Paul and Aaron make sure that personalities were different in each part. So you didn't like, well, who am I reading about? Like, whose perspective is now? And that was pretty difficult, I think. But I tried the best I could to make sure that Aaron's personality was Aaron's personality, and Paul's was Paul's. And obviously they're best friends and they share similar things. So they're talking about the same things, but different styles. Like Paul would curse a lot. Aaron wouldn't necessarily curse as much. Things like that.
And I also wanted to ask you, do you think about writing a second novel or any other work of fiction?
I hope so. But I think I have this like dormancy period because it's like a feeling of needing to soak things in.
Yeah.
And once things are soaked in, then maybe an idea happens and then I have the backing to kind of really give it like a good depth to it. So I think I would like to one day. And it might be completely different. It might just be, I hope nothing similar to that because I kind of like doing different things and trying different things. But yeah, hopefully.
And what you write on Medium is usually political pieces or historical pieces. Do you think that it's something that you will do later on?
Maybe I kind of got out of that a little bit into a different mindset, and the book kind of moved that away because I felt like there is like a good thing with that of fleshing out current events and ideas, but it's exhausting, and it's kind of it's okay to not have an opinion about everything, I think, in a sense. And that's the difficult thing with social media. You can have an opinion about everything because everything's going to pop up and you can write a comment about everything. And that could be like your 24/7. And I think moving into a novel and that's fiction, able to dive deep into more philosophical and not current events, but you're still talking about current events, but you're still talking about the human experience. And I think it's less anxiety, it's less confrontation, and I like it much more. So I do love like historical, political things, like picking out stories and being like, oh, that's an interesting story in history and how it relates to today. I still do enjoy that, but at the same time, I like the John Steinbeck critique of his society in a sense where he's writing this everyday story about this everyday, guy or girl in their life, and he's just sprinkling like that kind of critique or that kind of where society's at today, and not just like throwing it at people.
Yeah. But do you think that if you were to write something about our period, that it could sort of have this, not publishing it now, maybe later, but writing it in real time, and going back to the story and having this sort of insight on what happened before, which is today, but later in the future.
Yeah, and that's a cool idea for sure.
Yeah, I am just thinking about it because I watched a movie about there was this writer who wrote a book in the 80s, and he was speaking to someone and he was telling him about that book that he wrote about the 80s, and that person told him, why do people write about the past? It's so depressing. And he because that person was younger, and he said, no, I wasn't writing about the past, I was writing about it in real time. And there was some sort of reflection on that time because he was going through a lot of things, and it was sort of a parallel between those. It was in a intergenerational piece where two people were from different generations and discussing their experience. They were two gay Jewish men, and it was sort of how they were confronting each other about how they've experienced it.
No, it sounds difficult, and it sounds unique too, because I feel like if fiction gives that flexibility where you can have those scenarios pop up, but then like, what do you do with it? Like, how do you, like for me, it would terrify me to try to see this. To me, in writing this novel, I was able to, in my head, say, all right, I'm being genuine. I experienced it in a way and I could pull things. Like I know where I'm getting it from. Whereas if I'm writing about the past a little bit and I'm trying to have them relate to whatever the current thing, I'm like, am I getting this person right? Like, you know, that's very difficult, and it's impressive if, you know, when people do that, because I would be so fearful of not representing that kind of correctly.
Yeah, the matter of authenticity is so important.
Yeah.
And yeah, your story is very authentic, in the sense that it has that nostalgic vibe, but also it's hard to say whether that story could happen today or in the past, because
Mhm.
as we said before, it's very universal, in what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. Um, and is it something that you would do maybe later about your adult life, maybe, um, or adult life in general? Because like you wrote about teenagers, and it would be so interesting to maybe like see how your vision evolves as time
Mhm.
flies.
Yeah, that would be something like a revisit, and like a, I would think I would need like a long dormancy to kind of process and experience it too, right? And there, have you ever heard of Lincoln in the Bardo, the book?
No.
I always found it's this novel, a fictional novel about Lincoln, and when his son, I think Willie, he had a young son that passed away, and he would go quite frequently, and it's true that he would go to the cemetery and go inside, I guess you'd call like the mausoleum or the tomb, and sit with his son in the middle of the night. And the story is kind of this fictional thing where he actually like goes into like the afterlife world with his son, and his son is around in the novel, and it jumps around, it's crazy and it's kind of hard to follow, but it kind of like portrays his feelings in a more like visceral way about the loss of his son. And I always found it cool because they're taking something that's nonfiction. Lincoln actually did this, and Lincoln obviously suffered from this depression of losing his son, and then it tailors this into this fictional story of him going into the afterlife, and his son who passed away and having his voice in it. And I always found that as like a really interesting way of going about writing something like that.
And I wanted to ask you also, if you still had time to write, and if so, um, is it or do you consider yourself as a professional author?
No, I just feel like I do it for my own like hobby. I feel like it's one of my hobby, like a hobby, like reading and you know, taking care of like different plants I'll get and try to like understand them and learn them, and things like that. Um, Professional. I just kind of like, I'm like, in a sense, I have a career, and then I want to fill it with these things, you know, outside that like have like a healthier mindset, and writing is one of them. Um, sure, I think it would be amazing to be like a professional writer, but at the same time, there's that like it's not all. It's like the suburbs. Like it looks really nice. It's all perfect, and you know, everything's perfect. Then there's probably so much pressure, and you know, when money gets involved and you have different things, it's a very different. You know, you have to really be in a good space to keep enjoying it. I feel like, right.
So would you have any tip for someone who's starting in writing, or other authors?
I just write for yourself, write with friends, and you know, share your stories and things like that. And you can put it on things like, I love the platform, and like sharing it and posting it on different things. But that's like the icing, like that's like the finishing thing, and it's out there and it's out there. But when I think about it, I think about all those like days I enjoy like writing like a couple chapters, and like getting through ideas and developing the story. And I think that's the fun part. Like have fun with it, because uh, 90% of us more aren't going to be rich off of writing. We're going to be happy off of it. So make it like something you enjoy, not something you feel like you have to do, or you want to get recognized for.
And I had two more questions. One is about your writing style. I know which author that you inspired you were inspired by for As Iron Sharpens Iron. But if you were to write another book, is there any other author that you'd be inspired by other than Fitzgerald and Steinbeck?
That's a good question. I feel like I've read a couple novels. There's one, and I can't think of the author's name. You ever heard of the book Silence? They made it into a movie, actually.
Silence.
And Martin Scorsese made it into a movie. It's about missionaries who went to Japan when it was a very closed off society, and they were persecuted and tortured and things like that. But that kind of there's that historical, like I said, I like that, basing it on something historical that happened, and then delving into somebody that experienced it and kind of working through that. And in that novel, it's very interesting because it's that conflict of societies, like not understanding each other. One just coming in and saying like, this is the right way you should live. Like this is, we understand our existence now, and this is what you should do. And the other one's like, wait, no, like you're not doing this. But then their reaction is just as bad as the other one coming in and trying to enforce their kind of reality and worldview. I like that author for doing that, and like the way they wrote that is very cool. But to think of somebody else, I don't know. I feel like I have this like, or I read most of like that kind of classical Steinbeck and Fitzgerald, and then I kind of read it off of, I'll read something and then say if it references something or that author enjoyed another author, I'll go into that kind of like endless abyss of like, clicking. It's like a website that leads you to another website that leads you to another one. So that's usually my reading list, like expands that way. It's never just like, I'll look up what's trending online that's the most popular. I'll go with like the trails that each book leads me to.
Yeah, so it's not the last question, but have you ever read a book in which there was a reference to another book and instantly wanted to read or buy that book?
Definitely. I remember when I was in college, I went through like I was really interested in Robert F. Kennedy, like in his story.
Yeah.
And I just kept reading autobiographies on him. And then I read that he really enjoyed, especially when his brother was killed and he went through this kind of life-changing experience, he loved like the Stoic philosophy and all those things. And then I remember referencing Marcus Aurelius, and then I was like, Meditations, and it was the poll was like, oh, Roman Emperor wrote it, and it's a philosophy book. I was like, all right, I'll check it out. And I remember reading that one. I'm like, oh wow, that was a cool little like find in a totally different like biography world I was in. And then I went to this kind of philosophical realm, and then from that you go to like Epictetus and all these different philosophers, and it was like a trail that I didn't think one would lead me to one.
Yeah, and you actually wrote a profile about Robert F. Kennedy on Medium, in case anyone's interested in reading it. And my last question was, do you have a favorite book or a book that you'd highly recommend?
Well, right now I'm actually reading John Steinbeck's last book, The Winter of Our Discontent, the last book he ever wrote, and I like it a lot so far. But I think I would recommend. So hard to kind of pick. I would say Silence. I want to look up the author because I don't remember it. Possibly a Japanese author wrote it, I would say. But I find it like that perfect balance of a historical fiction and a good like philosophical piece, I feel like.
Well, thank you for being here with us. I really enjoyed our chat about As Iron Sharpens Iron because that was the first book that I read on Novel.
Oh, that's cool. Thank
and
you.
I loved it.
Thanks for talking about it. I really appreciate it.